This is Leadership Beyond, your community of conversation.
But this is the first time in my professional career that everybody, 100% of us, are consciously aware we are engaged in a change initiative.
Yeah, everything. I mean, COVID caused us all to go through change, right? At the same time, but our experiences were so different.
Facing these unprecedented times in isolation is pure insanity. Joining us today is Michele Wucker. Michele is a strategic advisor and best-selling author who coined the term Gray Rhino as a call to take a fresh look at how we respond to obvious, probable, and impactful risks. She founded the Chicago-based advisory firm Gray Rhino and Company and is a former media think tank executive. Her 4 books include the influential global bestseller, The Gray Rhino: How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore, and the recently released sequel, You Are What You Risk: The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World. The gray metaphor made headlines around the world as a framework for the ignored warnings for the COVID-19 pandemic and has appeared in media in more than 70 countries and 35 languages and still counting. It has sent tremors through the global stock market when Chinese officials warned of Gray Rhino financial risks. Central banks and security regulators around the world use the Gray Rhino theory, as do business strategists, board of directors, the business community, and emergency management professionals, insurers, ESG specialists, and policymakers focused on everything from national security to climate change. The concept also inspired a lyric in the hit single Blue and Gray by global mega K-pop phenomena BTS. It's also inspired characters in a video game and an experimental jazz single in Japan, a dance choreography in Australia. The Gray Rhino also has appeared in the pages of books by respected historians and diplomats, a Brazilian self-help book, and a science fiction novel.
Michele is such a joy to have as our guest today. It's incredible to me how she takes a topic of risk and can share from both the organizational perspective straight down to the personal perspective and back up again. And she just comes seamlessly in between those two and the spectrum and brings the personal stories that just so wonderfully illustrate a topic that you might think of as, not so inviting, but it was such a wonderful conversation in the way that Michele delivers it.
I'm going to highlight one word from what you just mentioned, Adrienne, and that is the word story. Michele does deep research, and she could have an intelligent conversation with any policy wonk, but she brings it to life through ordinary, extraordinary stories that we can relate to, helping us to navigate the material in a very personal way. She's just a delight to talk to. Welcome, Michele Wucker. Good afternoon, Michele. Thanks for joining us.
Delighted to be here. Great to see you again.
Hi, Michele. So nice to meet you.
Great to meet
you.
you
Do you mind sharing a bit about your background to get us started for the listeners who don't know? A little bit about your background and really how you got into the study of risk. Well, how is that, important and passionate to you?
Well, I've been through several lifetimes. My childhood best friend always, teases me about every 5 years you totally reinvent your life. I was writing about risk way before I thought I was. My first book was about the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and I went to a lot of cockfights, which I almost passed out at because of the blood. But there's this great quote that I use from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz saying that the issue with the cockfight is not that it's thrilling to win, not that it's painful to lose, but it's that these emotions around risks that society is put together. as a paraphrase. I went back and looked at the book a couple years ago and went, oh man, I was writing about this before I even knew it. But the real start was when I was writing about sovereign debt, emerging markets, bonds that were restructured from the 1980s debt crisis in the 1980s, and writing about those trading in the 1990s and ups and downs. And in 2000, I was watching Argentina very carefully. And you could see that the debt was going up, the economy was going down, the reserves were going down, the math was pretty easy, and wrote about a proposal to do a preemptive restructuring and clean it up. And that didn't happen. And of course, it was a huge collapse. And then 10 years later, Greece was in a similar situation. By then, I was running a think tank and doing other things, but I wrote a paper saying, hey, Greece, learn from Argentina. Don't do what they did. There's something big and scary coming at you. Do something. So it was right after Greece and their creditors came to an agreement that I sat down and I said, what is it about situations where some people see a big scary thing coming and do something about it, and other ones don't? And so that big scary thing coming at you became the Gray Rhino. And it's really, the image became a challenge to do better at dealing with the obvious things. And that became a book, which looked at really how these events unfold. And as I went around the world talking about it, I got so many questions about personal Gray Rhinos and personal lives that I followed it up with a book about the psychology of risk and the cultural and policy things that shape the risks that you take that most people aren't even aware of.
And it seems like You Are What You Risk is a lot deeper on the personal grappling, even though the societal grappling with risk is there. What made you go more personal? Because we all ignore our own Gray Rhinos, but I can remember as a young professional, I came to Chicago and people would joke about it. The teachers' pensions aren't funded, and all these teachers that work their whole life aren't, and they were kicking the can down the road. As you talk about, the first, or denial is the first stage, and the second is kicking it down the road, but almost just joking, while this big rhino is about to trample grandmother's pension. So there was personal in it, but it just feels like the new book is even more personal. Can you tell a little bit about that movement?
Well, it came as a big surprise to me. And, I talk about some of my own personal Gray Rhinos and the things that my relationship with risk over the years, which felt extremely risky personally. It wasn't something I was good at, but I felt that if I was asking other people to do it, I needed to do it myself. And the way that came about was through two things. The book came out in the US during the 2016 election campaign, where it was really hard to get any media, any air in the room. And the book came out in 2017 in Asia. And within 3 weeks, it was a huge bestseller in China. So I was going to China a lot. And I gave a talk that summer in Shanghai. And this young guy, 20 something, came up to me, or, with a black t-shirt and, super hip, and said, "Oh, I learned so much. Thank you. You helped me so much with my life." I went, "Are you talking to someone behind me? Because I'm not really a self-help writer." And I would always get questions about, how do I apply this to my personal life? And I struggled because I'm a finance and policy and business and strategy geek, and I didn't know what to do with it. And so I had these two questions. One, what is it culturally about Asia, where the Gray Rhino is huge? Everybody knows what it is. Where, I was having breakfast in a hotel in Beijing, and I could hear people behind me talking about Hui Xin Yu, which is Gray Rhino. And in the States, I've gotten a lot more resistance. Like, people don't want to admit that we're not good at dealing with obvious things. And so this cultural thing, and how that affects individual psychology, but also how individuals can apply this to their lives. And I struggled. And I called up a dear friend and mentor whom I had bounced a lot of the Gray Rhino off of when I was writing it. And he was the chairman of a private equity firm. And he said, Michele, there's a much closer relationship between personal and business than you think. He said, our investment team met last week to talk about the investments that didn't meet our expectations. And in every case, the red flags were there, but they weren't the ones that we looked at. It wasn't the business model, it wasn't the product, it wasn't some macroeconomic shock. It was the bad personal risk decisions. It was the drunk driving, the speeding, the getting caught in the Ashley Madison database leak of cheaters. It was the domestic violence. And it was all these CEOs making bad personal risk decisions who actually took down some of these companies. And we've seen so much more of that in the news these days, with CEOs who throw tantrums if they don't get the right kind of tequila. I've actually been watching the Hulu series on Theranos with Elizabeth.
Oh, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Fascinating. Yeah. And boards have started paying attention. There was one company where the CEO was bragging about having slept with a Russian spy, and the insurer went to the board and said, we're not going to insure you anymore if you keep this guy. So he was out. So boards are paying attention to it. People are paying more attention to it in their personal lives, in their careers, in their strategy, in the risks that they're taking. And the funny thing is that I was supposed to have finished the book in spring of 2020. And as you know, we had a little event there that involved risks. And so my Chinese publisher reached out and said, can you talk more about COVID? And I ended up doing a lot more reporting, because here it was every day. You'd see some people who were social distancing and sheltering at home and using masks as they went out, and very, very careful. And other ones, not so much. You saw huge differences among countries. You saw huge differences among businesses and their approaches. And I felt very much for the restaurant owners, because my great-grandfather, who came to Chicago at the beginning of the 20th century, I had been a chef all around Europe and New York and Chicago, had just moved to Milwaukee and opened his own restaurant, his lifelong dream, at the end of 1917. And like many restaurant owners during the pandemic now, he had a lot of really difficult decisions to make. And unfortunately, he died during the Great Flu, and so did the restaurant. And so I really felt for all the restaurant owners and workers during the pandemic. But it was, it was really appropriate that I finished the book during the first part of the pandemic, because that really brought risk to the forefront, to our personal relationships with risk, the people around us who basically made it riskier or not for us to go out. And it also brought up issues for businesses with, supply chains and all sorts of other things. And so it was really a nice way to work throughout the book, both these cultural things that affected policies and communities and different states, but also the individual personal behaviors. And I realized you can't separate public policy or business strategy from personal risk decisions. And it was a big risk to write about it that way, because publishers like books to be in the current affairs shelf, or the business shelf, or the self-help shelf. And I just felt like you really needed all three things at once, because they all affect each other.
But yours in both places.
Well, we often say that most business problems are people problems in disguise. And so we need to take some of the disguise away and look at this. You said something really interesting in there, and it's so obvious that I never would have thought about it, but it was relationship to risk. We'd often, of course you do, but we often don't think in terms of that. And we usually go to extremes. He's risk averse or she's risk tolerant. But it seems like, and it's clear in your book, that it isn't just that simple. So talk a little bit more about relationship to risk and why it matters and what we should pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that simple. And I've come to really hate this word risk averse, because the definition is that all things being equal, somebody takes less risk. Well, all things aren't equal. I mean, for me to walk down a dark alley at 3 a.m. is very different from a football linebacker to make that same trip. For a woman executive to make a mistake, particularly in a quote unquote non-gender typical position, she's going to get punished much more than a man. And there's academic research that backs this up. And looking back at some of these CEOs and their decisions, both in business and personally, it struck me that every risk that you take says something about who you are to the world. It's like, if you go to the immigration line and stick your finger in that little green light on the biometric indicator machine, that imprint, those risks that you take, those decisions, tell the world who you are. And what's behind it is absolutely a fascinating study that helps you to understand yourself better and to optimize the environment, the processes, the habits that you develop, so that you can take smarter risks depending on what's most comfortable for you. And it's like a real fingerprint, which really has three parts to it. There's the genetic, the whorls and the arches and the loops that you can't change, which is why it's such a great biometric indicator. That's your innate personality, is who you are. The second part is the lived experience, like a scar on your finger when you cut it. And that interacts with your personality, because some people cut themselves with a knife and never want anything sharper than a plastic butter knife. And other people say, oh, no big deal, I survived that, I can go on, I'm going to be a sushi chef. So those, the personality innate, the lived experience, and then the third part you might think of as the soft cream you put on your fingers or the manual labor. That also changes your relationship with risk, and it's where you have the most control. And that involves how self-aware you are about risk in your relationship. That's the number one part of the habits and processes that you have. Like, if you know that you are more likely to leap without looking, you can create processes and habits to help you to make better choices. Or, if you hate jaywalking, but you live in like New York City where you have to, you can figure out whose hand to hold to get across the street. Your environment, the social environment, the culture of the company where you work, the type of job you take. Some people are super well suited for working for a big corporation for their whole life, and other people get bored and are much happier at startups. And then the other part, which I found fascinating, is the physiological and neurobiological part. Things like, whether you've taken Tylenol that day, whether you've had spicy food, the temperature, the music you're listening to, all of these things that affect your stress level, your heart rate variability, your cortisol levels, all of this affects the risks, the way you choose which risks to take or pass on. None of us think about that. And, to be honest, before I started working on You Are What You Risk, I didn't give it a second thought either.
Yeah. So knowing everything that goes into how we respond to risk, how do we take that information once we learn it about ourselves and use it to make, I wouldn't say it's the right decision, because that's very subjective, right? So with the best decisions for us, for our companies, for our families, how do you kind of harness that knowledge to take action?
Yeah. And it's hard. You often don't even know if it's the right decision until far down the road. Even if it seems like something didn't work out at first, it sets in place a chain reaction where it might end up the way you wanted to. So it starts with the self-awareness. There's a tool I love out of the UK, a company called Psychological Consultancy, the Risk Type Compass. It's based on a lot of the big five psychometric testing methods, the Hogan method. And it's a bunch of questions related to choices that you might make about different kinds of risks. And it measures, very much like a compass, two poles, how methodical or impulsive you are when you're dealing with risk, and how anxious or calm you are. So there are 8 risk types on this compass, and they also are, closer or farther from the axis, from the middle. So there's some people who can have characteristics of a couple of them. Like I'm, for example, mildly intense, which is a wonderful oxymoron, but it also makes sense. I mean, obviously, I'm very intense about risk. I pay a lot of attention to it.
I'm sharing the screen so people can get
Oh, nice.
a picture of that.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And if you go to the psychological consultancy website, there's a whole bunch more information about it. But it's, and the mildly intense, obviously, I can relate to all of the different risk types because I have to, that's what I do.
Study it, right?
So when you understand yourself, that helps you to create the right social environment. And it also helps you to understand the people around you. This is often used for scatter plots in teams in heavy industries where safety is really important, or in boards. And the Jeff Trickey, the creator of this tool, told me that he often finds that when they work with boards on this, he finds that people of similar risk types just happen to have gravitated towards sitting near each other in the room. But once you understand your personality, you can think about, okay, do I want to have a closer relationship with risk? Do I feel like I'm too shy about things? Do I want to change my process? I get asked all the time if there is a quote unquote, ideal risk type. And there's not, because we need them all. We hear a lot about diversity in decision making, and people look at, at gender, at age, at ethnicity, at industry, at skills, et cetera. But they don't look explicitly enough at risk. And that is a really important thing, because you need the mix. You need the person who can be super methodical and make sure you're complying with whatever rule, but you also need the people who are innovative and creative and willing to stretch so that you can grow. But if you are that sort of methodical person, well, that's a great place to put your skills, that you have something that other people don't. But if you want to take bigger risks, then you can think about what it is that makes you more comfortable. And in many cases, that's information, and creating a circle of people around you who can help to advise you on, on everything, on, how risky something is, how confident you can be about those assessments, what you might need to do if the risk doesn't turn out the way that you would like. And so you can really learn a lot about yourself that way. You can learn about your team. You can learn about the people around you to see if their collective risk fingerprint matches with what you are looking for your company. You can use it in recruiting and hiring. You can use it in promotions. You can use it in decision architecture. So hugely, hugely useful in the business context.
So I also like that you use the Chinese symbol for crisis with danger and opportunity in there, but you use a term that I recognized instantly isn't the way we normally think. We think of risk as a negative, and are we willing to embrace it or not? And you talk about risk neutral. Say a little bit more about the difference that makes, that framework.
Sure. Yeah. And, that Chinese phrase is so interesting because, this sort of, old saying, people told me, oh, it's a mix of crisis and opportunity. And then I actually talked to people about what that means. They said, it's actually not quite that. It's about being at this moment, this tipping point of change. So whenever you hear, coach talking about this, oh, it's crisis and opportunity, it's actually kind of something that people in the West made up. I mean, there are lots of different elements in this. And what's interesting is that one of them looks like a cliff, which is very similar to the etymology of the word risk in the West, in Arabic, and that idea of the cliff that you can either topple over the top, or it was originally a maritime term in the West, and it was about whether you might actually bump into things underground that you don't know about. So first of all, it's a little bit different, but I ask this question all the time when I'm doing webinars and workshops and things. Is before we start, I ask people to put in the chat or to say out loud, how do you define risk? And you immediately start seeing people's biases. You'll have some that are talking about danger, peril, loss, and you'll see others to talk about, risk appetite, opportunity, gamble, adventure. And then you have the people in the middle who say, okay, well, it depends. And that's obviously where I spend a lot of my time. And I'm always encouraging people to ask themselves, if they're considering a particular risk, okay, riskier or less risky than what? What are the alternatives? Because you're going to have choices among things. And in many cases, for example, with careers, and particularly with women who tend to stay in the same job longer than men do, we have this misconception that staying in the same job, particularly for a big established company, is the safer, quote unquote, less risky option. But if it's the kind of place where, once your boss gets kicked out, you're going to get demoted or kicked out, the new guy doesn't like you, it's not using your skills, it's not a good fit for your personality, it's holding you back. Well, it's actually riskier in that case to stay in the same job. So we need to really revisit what we define as, high risk, low risk, opportunity, danger, and understand that it's really a spectrum and a continuum. And this idea that you can measure a risk in a very simple quantitative way that's very clear is not really the way we think it is. You think about subprime loans, for example, in the last great financial crisis, and many of those were rated as investment grade, high credit, which they turned out not to be. We saw here, Silicon Valley Bank, which just happened recently, and they got clean bill of health from their auditors and others just right before everything fell apart. And so things aren't as simple as we think. And the other part is, when you are aware of your relationship with risk, and when you are really looking at a risk, when you recognize, hey, this is something we need to pay attention to, that actually reduces the risk of it going off the rails, because you are already starting to prepare to deal with it. And so I think about risk often as a room full of fun house mirrors, where when you go in, you turn, you change your perspective a little bit, you actually see something as very, very different. And two people standing at different places in the room are going to see very different things. And we need to be a lot more aware that that risk estimations and risk, quote unquote, probabilities are not necessarily what we think they are.
Would you argue that putting risks into different formulas, that it seems to me from everything you're explaining that only gets you so far, because there is this people side to it, and there's always people involved. If you're making a business decision and you put it into a formula to capture how risky is this, but there could be a lack of awareness for some element of it that formula doesn't pull out. Would you agree with that?
In many cases, yes. In many cases, that quantitative approach makes sense. Actuarial tables, but obviously you want to revise them every so often, because life expectancies change, new medications, new treatments, different lifestyles, things like that. Or with, say, 100-year, 500-year floods. We're seeing a lot of people going and revising those climate risks because the situation is changing. And you obviously need some sort of quantitative measure, because otherwise we wouldn't have insurance, we wouldn't have good sensible interest rates, we wouldn't have all sorts
of standards
things. Yeah, exactly. So you've got to do something. In many cases, that's better than nothing, but it's important to take into account times when it might not match. And the other thing is that historically, in many companies, the risk professionals have been in a silo. Other people get very intimidated, say, "Oh, it's really quantitative, and I don't get it." And if you look at a lot of the risk education, risk literacy websites and programs, they often are about calculating the probability of this versus that, which for most people doesn't doesn't really resonate or make a lot of sense. You can't remember all of that stuff. And risk also very much is behavioral. It's the the intern just out of school who's sitting in the supposedly most menial task, who clicks on a phishing email and lets the hackers into the whole system. It's the people who either feel comfortable or don't feel comfortable saying, hey, we got a problem, we need to do something about it now. And that really goes down to the company's culture. If there's a psychological safety, if people feel like they're going to be listened to, or if they're going to be just shut down. So this, I think we need to really rework how we think about risk, and particularly the behavioral side of it. And in different people's risk fingerprints, there are some people who really rely on the spreadsheets and the numbers. I mean, a lot of the policy world, you'll see cases where policymakers or the CEOs will be out there saying, oh, well, according to our studies, there's no risk. This is safe. And people experiencing something very differently. I mean, a lot of people riding an airplane for the first time are scared, and they know it's safer than riding in a car, but they're still scared. And we have to acknowledge those emotions. And we also have to be aware that not all of these risk estimations are okay. I mean, I actually just recently discovered that I have a very strong reaction to an ingredient that's in most toothpastes. And if you read about it, safe, totally fine. And I'm
Not
like,
for you.
Not safe. So, and so there are a lot of things. Or as someone with celiac disease, which I talk about in the book, that I can't have gluten or very bad things happen. There's this standard of 20 parts per million, which is safe, quote unquote, but I can't tolerate that. There's some beer that's gluten removed. I still don't understand how they do it, but they're very good. They test every batch, and they put the serial number of each batch on the inside of the stopper on the top of the beer can cap. And so you open it on the bottle, and you can check to see how that tested. And I've gone, and it's tested below 5 points per million, which is the lowest point that they can measure. And I found with that, I'm okay if I have one, but if I have two, I have problems. So I think we need a lot more transparency about what risks are really there or not, and what we know or don't. As we saw during the pandemic, you had a lot of health policy people coming out and saying something with great authority that they ended up having to walk back because it turned out to be not as true as they thought it was. And so I think that when we're communicating about risk, it's important to say, well, this is what we know right now. This is why we think that, but also realize there could be more information coming out that changes how we think of things.
When you mention the emotions, I'm reminded of the Challenger, which you mentioned in the Gray Rhino, is that this little mistake that everyone should have been able to see, there's sort of a momentum of groupthink. And it takes a lot of emotional upset to go against the social proof grain. And so what I'm thinking about is first understanding our own risk factors, and then deciding what's important to us and when we need to challenge our natural risk inclination. And that would be subjectively different. And for those that just stick to their formulas, if that was all that was needed, the last bubble would have been the tulip thing back in the Netherlands. I mean, they'll always say, oh, we should have seen this bubble coming, but everybody wants to get in when the pleasure is high, and no one wants to be the first one out until the whole thing collapses. So I think paying attention to the value system and the emotions around it will help us to make better decisions.
Well, it's really interesting that we're having this conversation now, as there's a lot of evidence that what people call the everything bubble is popping. And I, in the Gray Rhino, I talked a lot about some of these biases that are very common, groupthink, confirmation bias, availability bias, things like that. And at the time, they were sort of, behavioral science had really evolved, and behavioral economics. So people are aware of these biases. But since I wrote The Gray Rhino, there's been a lot more work on the differences among people. Some people are more vulnerable to these biases and not. There's been some research showing how awareness and certain changes in habits and processes can actually make you less vulnerable to these biases. And some of the work that I did in You Are What You Risk showed me that it's not just the habits and processes, although that's really important. It's something you can control. It's the relationship between that and other factors, particularly the lived experience factor and the perceptions of the risk itself. For example, if you perceive that there's going to be a lot of benefit from something, you're actually likely to underestimate the risk that is involved with it. If you have a lot of knowledge and a lot of control over a situation, you are likely to be more comfortable with a risk than otherwise. There's an example I share in You Are What You Risk about the 737 Max. The plane crashes. There were 2 plane crashes within a short period of time, and big debate over whether to keep the planes in the air or not. And as that was going on, the Pilots Association in the US came out with a statement saying, we're comfortable with it, we're fine. Well, and that's because, pilots, obviously they've got the steering stick in their hand. It's not a wheel on a plane. But they have a lot more knowledge, they have a lot more control of the situation. And the flight attendants came out and said, we are, they're not the ones who are driving. And so differences in those perceptions are hugely important. And I think this is very relevant for marketers, thinking about how your clients are seeing a particular risk, and particularly marketers of products internationally, because our bias is to see standards and products from other countries as often not as safe as ours. Now, this is not true for every country and different relationships, but if you know that there's going to be an innate bias thinking that your product is less safe, then you're going to need to up your game. And so understanding your clients, your customers' risk perceptions and why they're perceiving those risks that way is hugely important. It's a great communication tool, and it's a great communication tool among team members as you're deciding where to go, what the next step is, and within boards.
The perception is the reality in that case. If you think it's risky and I want you to buy in, me saying, oh, well, I've done the research, it's not risky at all, is not helping at all to gain buy-in from you.
Yeah, and I think that, the emotional people need to be more, they need to listen more to the people who are looking at the numbers in the studies, and the people who are doing the numbers and studies need to recognize this emotional component. And I would say, anecdotally, probably there's more onus on the wonky analytical people to take into account emotion than the other way around. I mean, there are times when no matter how much something is okay, those emotions take over. I had the rest of my wisdom teeth taken out recently, and oh man, I got there. I was like shaking, quivering bowl of Jello. Nothing like most of my friends see me as. And I know that the medications are good. I know it only takes a few minutes. I know this doctor's really good, and luckily this place required you to bring a friend to stay with you the whole time. And I had a friend with me who I always hear comforting her daughter, and she was really fantastic, and that helped. But there is just no arguing about those emotions. Those emotions were completely in control of me, despite everything that I knew up here.
Even with the knowledge, the information. Sometimes it's the gut. You got to follow that gut, even though all the facts tell you something else.
Yeah. Here's a challenge.
Balance.
Go ahead, Adrienne.
Well, it's balance, right? I'm hearing it's the balance. It's the awareness of all of those points of view and perspectives and tendencies, and that, but it's balancing all of that out, like so much of our life, right? It's always everything in balance.
Absolutely. And totally different for everyone. My dad's always saying to me, Michelle, I couldn't do what you do. I couldn't be an entrepreneur. I couldn't be, jetting all over the world all the time. And he certainly isn't going to be trying new foods. He's got a completely different attitude to that from mine, very Midwestern diet. But I look and I say, I can't imagine having had 4 kids, and that's a whole different kind of risk, but it's not something that I'd be comfortable with. And another question I often ask in my workshops is, what's the biggest risk that you've ever taken? And then after I get that, I say, okay, well, what's the biggest risk you've ever not taken? And a lot of professional women have come out and said that I would not take the risk of getting married, which is interesting. That's an example of how social environment has changed. Certainly from my mother's generation, not getting married
was the risk,
far bigger risk. And so those things change over time. You see some of the statistics on drug use and overdoses among women and men. You see, I think even some of the driving and some of the other data on men and women, and some of those have converged as society has changed. And it's not that the risk has become different; it's that perceptions on each side have changed. And it's like the pandemic. You see all these articles near the end of it saying, oh, these people have decided to take big risks because the pandemic made their risk tolerance go up. They're the great resignation, and people are quitting their job and they're doing all these risky things. And my perception was no, absolutely not. Is that they've changed what's most important to them. They've changed their priorities. And this goes back to the point I made early on, which is that the risks you take tell the world who you are, just like a fingerprint does, a biometric indicator. And those decisions, those choices to leave jobs, to move, to do different things, those were a reprioritization of risks. And those were telling the world what was most important to the people making those decisions.
That's such a wonderful wrap up, isn't it?
It is. And I will say a little plug for the book, and we'll have information in the show notes how to get it. But using the fingerprint, you look at risk through so many different lenses. And it really provides a lot of different individual ways to grapple with their own risk factors. So I love the way it's organized, not surprisingly at all, but pleasantly, that you can just put on different lenses, which changes your perception, and make a couple of decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very personal thing, and it's something that's important to risk professionals and non-risk professionals. One of the early talks about the Gray Rhino was with the Business Continuity Institute, and a lot of people there came up to me and said this is very helpful in talking to people who don't stay up at night thinking about these things the way I do. And I really see both books, the Gray Rhino and You Are What You Risk, as a bridge and a conversation starter, and a way to get individuals and executives and policymakers to think about what they're doing, so that we can all take smarter and better risks, and that's going to be good for everyone.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your work and for making space to talk to us.
So insightful.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciated the conversation with you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Beyond podcast. We hope you benefited from this conversation as much as we have. We invite you to join our community of conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to sign up at aleadershipbeyond.com for free materials and updates. That's aleadershipbeyond.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode.